Hello and welcome to this special discussion on the politics and economics of immigration. So, we have with us a special guest, Professor Neeraj Kaushal. She teaches social policy. She is a professor of social policy at Columbia University, and she has done extensive research on comparative immigration policies, its impact on society, on economics, on politics. The last few years, we have seen immigration emerging as a big issue affecting politics around the world, creating a new kind of nativist nationalism, if you will. So, we have Neeraj here to talk about her research, which is encapsulated in a book called "Blaming Immigrants: Nationalism and Economics of Global Movement." So, this is what Neeraj's work is all about. Welcome to our show, Neeraj. Now, tell us something about how you researched this whole issue of immigration, both in the context of United States and other countries too, and tell us about some of the broad conclusions in very simple terms that you have reached in this book.
So, immigration, as you said, is a hot button issue. In country after country, in Europe, in the United States, it has turned political findings. It has resulted in immigration becoming a highly political issue. It has led to many political parties becoming extremely right wing against immigration. And I was interested when I was doing this book to find out what are the causes of these problems in Western countries and in other countries. In this book, I document that it's not just in Western countries, but immigration is a hot button issue in many democracy, in many Asian countries, in India as well as in African countries. Latin America has done much better, but there too there are issues about immigration.
And as we talk about this, we have a Brexit Prime Minister taking charge in Britain, right?
So Brexit is another, most of the surveys around that time showed that Brexit, immigration was one of the biggest issue on Brexit. So I wanted to look at in this book about what are the fundamental issues in these countries, in Western democracies, that are creating discontents in these countries, and I wanted to see whether any of these issues is related to immigration, how immigration is impacting those fundamental problems, and I wanted to see whether immigration is actually the cause of those problems or immigration has become just like a scapegoat, because every country is facing these fundamental
and your broad
problems.
conclusion is that immigration invariably becomes scapegoat, right?
Yeah, so I looked at 7 major issues. One is growing inequalities in these countries, stagnation in productivity, rising refugee movements, increase in terrorism, increase in identity issues. And I find that immigration is not per se immigration that is leading to these crises, but the inability to manage immigration, the ability of countries to manage immigration has been, you see failure all over the world. And I find that
failure at this juncture, or do you see cycles, periods of success, periods of failure?
Immigration management generally has been, wherever people have tried to manage immigration by creating walls or by creating fences or by restricting movements or trying to deport people, those instances have been clearly instances of failure. You see everywhere. Okay. In most countries you see these extreme measures wherever you've tried to create walls. So for instance, at the around 1990, there were very few countries which have fences and walls, and over the years there are about 165 countries where are all these walls, and we don't see these walls, these restrictions don't really control immigration. Immigrants find other more perilous ways of entering into countries where they want to go. So these restrictions have not been very effective, but on the other hand they have led to a lot of human cost. And in the book, I actually find some of the other economic causes of discontent, as I said, growing inequality or stagnation in productivity in Western countries. Immigration can actually help in those areas instead of hurting. So there's a very mixed picture emerges in major areas, major fundamental issues where immigration is involved. There you see it's really the ability and the intention of countries to manage immigration, and actually not the real level of immigration. So let me give you a few examples why I see that immigration is not the issue. So when the results of
Not the issue as in the
is not the primary cause of growing discontent in Western democracy, and that there are other factors.
or growing inequalities as we see.
Or growing inequality could be one example, or the way countries are opposing immigration, the far conservative parties are emerging, or parties that used to be liberal earlier, their own agenda is becoming more and more conservative and more against immigration. I find that it's not immigration per se, and I'll give you some examples.
And your study shows that the Reagan era saw the largest number of undocumented
legalization,
immigrants getting legalized, right? So even conservative politics at one time was different in their attitude or its attitude to immigrants, undocumented immigrants.
That's right. In the US, interestingly, immigration was a bipartisan issue. So there are some conservatives who used to be for it, and there were liberals who were for immigration. And as you were saying that, Reagan in 1986 passed a law that led to one of the largest legalization of undocumented in probably the world. About 3.2 million people legalized.
Do you see that as a paradox, considering what the conservatives, the right is doing today in America? Trump, for instance, trying to erect walls.
We've seen a dramatic change. Immigration was the issue of an issue that conservatives were very proud of, partly because it's linked with the economy, because economy wants more immigrants, more workers. They want to have more liberal policies on entry of workers. And they have, on the other hand, social conservatism is leading them. The fear that immigrants is going to ride over all our, our cultural values, or whatever be the reason, that has swept the, the conservative thinking now. So things have really changed. If you observe American economy in the 1980s, it was a very different, where the politics was conservatives were more for immigration. Even as early as George W. Bush, when he came to power in 2000. At that time, it was very possible. In fact, he was talking about having a guest worker program for undocumented Mexicans who were in the US at that time. Unfortunately, 9/11 happened, and that changed the politics of immigration in the whole country. And his agenda on immigration was swept away because of that.
Tell me, Neeraj, I want you to talk a little more about your research and the findings of your research in regard to the impact that immigration historically has had on US society and other societies too, where you've done your study. Now, it's anecdotally or commonsensically, all societies, modern societies, especially like the United States, which is barely 250 years old or thereabouts, these societies have been forged by immigrants, right? Whether you take the immigrants from Europe, Irish, Scottish, German, now they all came from outside and created the society. So commonsensically, it's very clear that that these societies grew out of the talent or the skills or the genius of immigrants. Now, why is it becoming so difficult now in today's climate to convince people that immigration is good for economics, good for politics? I mean, good politics, good economics need not be antithetical to a good immigration policy.
So, in most of Europe, opposition to immigration is somewhat not because of economic reasons, it's more because of identity issues, and those issues are big in those countries. United States, there are some places where this identity issue, because they are afraid that the demography is changing very rapidly. Many states in the country are now they don't have a majority population, and many counties don't have no ethnic group. So the non-Hispanic white population is not a majority in many counties, and because of that there is this fear that these other cultures are going to
So you got data on these counties.
Yeah. So
also, right?
and the thing is that that's also the country about 20 years ago when Clinton left, he actually praised that this is going to be a country. He was priding about the growing diversity in the country. So the US in that sense is very interesting. There are parts of the country where people are pride about the growing diversity, and there are other places where there are growing discontent, there are growing fears about. But then coming back to the economics of immigration, now it's clear, most researchers, there's no among economists or sociologists, there's no friction. Everybody agrees that immigration has a positive overall total impact on a country. Now then the question is that what about specific groups? Specific places where immigration is. So there are two kinds of discontent. One is the federal government benefits from immigration, because social security, immigrants come at a time when they are young, so they are always contributing to social security. But some of the local costs, like cost of education for instance, or some certain other benefit, roads and other things, those are within the purview of the local government. So the initial impact on local government could be negative and federal government could be positive. So that's one level. At another level, in terms of individuals, so as I said, the country benefits, everybody benefits, but within narrowly defined occupational categories. For instance, entry of doctors, foreign doctors, Indian doctors may affect the economic opportunities of US doctors. Theoretically you can see that, but the thing is that Indian doctors are also providing better, creating healthcare facilities in areas that are not being reached by American doctors. So you could use the same example for other things.
You're right. Like Australia is much more liberal about Indian doctors going to their far-flung states to practice.
That's true about the US too, that initially it's easier to get a visa if you practice in a area where there's less concentration, less availability of medical facilities, and also in terms of when you get a license, the system is such that Indian doctors are more likely to get into specialization where there's which are less profitable, and also specializations where in hospitals which are far flung.
So Neeraj, let's talk about the tension between what people now describe as economic globalization, which has its own logic, right? If birth rates are indeed, if economies have to grow around the world, especially around the developed world, where fertility rates are dropping, so to keep basic economic growth going at a minimum level, they need people. So that is the logic for getting in people through immigration, the right immigration policy, which you have studied, the various countries. That is one aspect, which has its own relentless logic, right? So today what is happening is that is clashing with nationalization or some native national identity based nationalism in politics. So do you see this conflict now coming to a head, or where are we headed? I mean, or is this just a cycle? Eventually, the logic of economic globalization will prevail over the whole the whatever the factor which we describe as narrow nativist nationalism.
So it's interesting that there is growing discontent. Places that are very where you see rise in anti-globalism, or more particularly, let me stick to the topic of immigration. Angst towards immigration are not the ones that are receiving most immigration. So let me give you the example. Start with Brexit, and I'll give you a few more examples. Once the results of the Brexit elections was out, it was clear that the places that have the largest number of foreign-born population were also the ones that wanted to stay. And the places that had the largest number of fewer number of immigrants, much lower foreign-born population.
Study shows, right?
Yeah, and then you can actually extend it to Europe. So Europe,
this is about Britain that you just spoke about.
This is Europe, but let's move to Britain, and then we'll move to the US. In Britain, in the EU, countries that have been most against immigration. For instance, Poland said that we would not let a single Syrian refugee resettle in Poland. If you look at a chart of foreign-born population in Poland, it's the lowest in any European countries. It's actually less than 2%, whereas the European average is 12%. Same thing about Austria. Their foreign-born population is about 6%. So
you're saying those societies which are used to having immigrants, they are far more comfortable with it.
They're very. So let's move to the US now. US, New York is very, very open to immigration. California, these are also the places where have more immigrants. So in the last 3-4 years, even as Trump is talking about restricting immigration, the mayor of New York has come up with a ID, New York ID, which is primarily to provide an ID to the undocumented living in New York. And the mayor was very open about it, that they don't want anybody who don't have.
Runs contrary to Trump's policy, right?
So this is a place where there's very high immigration, increasing immigration, but they also want to, so state wants to incorporate undocumented, Trump wants to
So you're saying that this paradox is you can see it at play in day-to-day life, right?
You can see it within countries, and you can see
states,
globally where you see that places that have less immigration are the ones that are more afraid. So places that are far more homogeneous, societies that are far more homogeneous, they are the ones who are afraid of any diversity. So you would hear several European politicians say, well, we don't want to look like Berlin, or we don't want to look like Brussels. So there is more the fear that you don't want to be in that kind of situation, fear of the outsider, rather than actual experience. And some of it is also because places that have had historically large number of immigrants, like you were talking about Australia, many places in Australia, where they have been able to establish institutions that can provide for the immigrants, provide for services, bilingual services, or some other kind of services that meet the needs of immigrant populations. And the ones that are now receiving immigrants, they don't have those institutions, and it's going to probably take that much time for them to
These institutions are very important, right? So are you confident that this new wave of whatever nativist nationalism that we are seeing in the US and some parts of Europe, will they impact some of these institutions which have been built historically to deal with immigration in a very rational sort of way?
My reading is somewhat different. I have a feeling that places that have always been more open to immigrants are becoming even more open, and the places, at least in the US,
these institutions will grow stronger. So that's the hope you're expressing.
But not in places that have been against immigrants that are becoming even more closing towards. They do not want to. They have not been establishing those institutions. So immigrants basically go where they feel that they are welcome, and they are basically going to places, to states or cities where there are more immigrants and there are more such institutions.
Like you're right. Like when you go to Europe, even anecdotally, some countries, when you enter their their capital, you find that they're far more visually multicultural, like Amsterdam, Holland, for instance. I don't know, like you said, Austria may not seem like multicultural in that sense. So probably Holland would be far more easy in receiving immigrants than other countries.
Yeah, and I think I want to get back to the other point that you were making. What would happen? What is it that's going to drive immigration? Whether countries are going to become more close?
Yeah. What's the long term or the medium term trend that you see?
So one big
In
force
this
that
tension
is,
between politics and economics. Yeah.
is one big force that you were earlier talking about was the demography.
Yeah.
You know how these Western economies, societies are aging, and for instance, in the U.S. in the last 30 years. 50%, half of the increase in labor force was because of immigrants or their descendants, and in the next 30 years, all of it is because of immigration. All the growth, addition to the labor force. Europe, the situation is even worse. So on the one hand, you see a lot of demand for immigration from industry, especially immigrants in certain skill categories. So you see that race globally, even in these
that's
countries.
That's a compelling logic for
Yeah.
these economies to keep getting immigrants in order to probably survive globally in a competitive economic globalizing world, right?
Yeah, but that same thing is happening in other countries also. So the competition for labor is going to go stronger in Asia as well. For instance, some of the work that I've done shows that between 2015 and 2050, so in the next 30 years, let's say, working age population in China will decline by 150 million. That's a huge number, right? So my interaction with the Chinese government, that they openly admit that the biggest challenge they face to their economic growth is going to be
drop in fertility. Yeah?
No, they're going to be the scarcity of talent.
Scarcity of talent. Okay.
So they have pointed that
even birth rates are supposed to decline in China, right?
China,
by the next 20 years.
Yeah, they're already quite
sort of
low.
Flatten out, right?
And their policy about two-child policy, the change in policy
It's
hasn't really worked.
Hasn't worked. Yeah.
So these pressures, you feel them all over the world except for some parts of Africa. In India too, we are going to see an increase in population up to a point, but
and then
beyond that,
plateau.
Yeah.
But tell me, how do you read now? Coming back to India, how do you see India's policy in regard to what's going on, in Assam, for instance? India is also coming up with a new policy on immigration, stroke refugees, people who have historically come to India and worked here and are spread across the country. Now, this government is talking about creating a national register for citizens. In Assam, 4 million people, it is feared, would lose their citizenship. How do you see this process play out? It's again, it's part of the larger trend of nativist nationalism.
So I think would like to divide this in two parts. One is immigration policy, and the second part is about refugees.
Yeah, the two are different. Yeah.
And on immigration policy, we don't really have one, and we need to learn from many. We can see the experience of other countries.
Yeah, but we've had we have been aware of undocumented workers coming from various countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, coming and working here. And there are two different experiences. I want to talk about that.
Yeah. So okay, let's. So we've had a very good experiment with Nepal for many years. We have, in a way, open borders. Nepalis can come and work here, and Indians can go and work there. So we have a large number of, although we don't have any official account of it, other estimates show that there's a large Nepali population here, and this system has worked very well for us. I can understand that we can't have a similar policy with Pakistan, although we don't even see that many Pakistanis here. On the other hand, we have, another example of Bangladesh, and there are various estimates. Again, we don't have any official estimates, but because of the lack of official estimates, you see here several figures about number of undocumented, or to use the word, illegal Bangladeshi in India. Now the thing is, if they are economic migrants, you can't stop them. We can see from other countries' experience, immigrants basically go where their opportunities are. So Trump has tried to build the wall, and what has happened is it has not reduced immigration. Immigrants have built tunnels. They've used coyotes, smugglers to get in. That basically increases the cost of human cost of migration, but immigration has not stopped. Immigration in these, and that's US, but in Europe as well.
Even illegal immigration.
Yeah, Europe also, you see that immigration, by building fences and gates, you've not been able to restrict them. And illegal immigration, particularly in the US, is completely in sync with the economy. When the economy is doing bad, illegal immigration is high. When the economy is doing badly, it goes down, unlike any other form of
like supply of labor, right? Demand supply of labor. Yeah.
So from global experience, you can tell that you cannot restrict immigration like that. The other thing, so it's there's.
But in India's case, you feel that this government is also looking at immigration from the religious lens, right?
That part is because, I think the government is thinking of immigration policy from a religious lens, and that for economic immigration and also for refugee policy should be basically based on human rights, all over the world. That has been, and we've had some good examples. We have where we have, Afghani refugees have come here and they've gone back now. But then we've had some good history, and I think we need to follow that for a country like India, which is hoping to rise on the global scene. We have to have a refugee policy which is based on human rights perspective and not on a religious lens.
So, do you think India has thought through what will happen to these 4 million estimated people who may lose their citizenship? Where will they go? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you that I don't think this whole process has been thought through. You hear words like, that people would be deported or people would be put in camps. Again, I think there's a lot of evidence that you can see from other countries' mistakes and see that these things have not worked. Deportation in Europe, they've tried to deport people in smaller quantities. They send them in plane loads, and people sending countries refuse to take them because they say that, but what is the evidence that these people are from our country? So same thing we might experience, especially here where the language they speak is the same. So I don't even know whether the people who have been identified, there's a lot of questioning about these 4 million or whatever number you're saying are not Indians. It's quite likely.
Is there any other place, any other example, Neeraj, in the world where such a large scale of possible deportation, or is happening based on religion, on religious considerations?
Deportation, here also deportation has not happened, but I also think that it would be a negative policy. I can't think of, but I might be missing something. That there's religion has been, in many parts of the world, religion has been a cause of fear towards immigrants, has been, and it's mostly exploited by political parties. In the US, for instance, both religion as well as ethnicity, racism has been used for, people from Mexico, for instance, is the ethnicity.
People are not talking about ethnic democracy, which seems like a contradiction in terms.
I know, exactly. And then religion again, there's anger towards this fear about Muslim immigrants in the US. Similarly here, so political parties have used both religion. I feel like in many European countries as well as in the US, fear of religion has been used to sell exclusionist agenda, and you feel some of that here as well, and I don't think, experience in terms of putting undocumented people in camps, it has not worked anywhere in the world. It has actually been most costly to the countries, to the receiving countries. Like we have this example of Dabod in Kenya, where this is the third largest city in the country, where this has caused a lot of increase in terrorism.
You recommend that Prime Minister Modi does what Reagan did in the 80s and 90s, where he legalized the largest number of undocumented
I think
immigrants, right?
that is one way of bringing them, because they are not going anywhere, because the solutions that we propose are not have not worked anywhere else in the world. So legalization is the best way. And I mean, I've read studies recently that Bangladesh is doing very well in terms of its human indicators, and you know, if that is the trend, then you would actually not find increase in or flow of
Incremental flow from Bangladesh to India.
so the best thing is to legalize them, incorporate them,
Rather than try to push them back into some other territory, right?
exactly.
Thank you, Neeraj, for talking to us on this hot button issue, as you said. So that was Professor Neeraj Kaushal from the Columbia University of Social Work. Again, do read her book, Blaming Immigrants, Nationalism and Economics of Global Movement. Very rich in the research that she's done on comparative immigration policy from across different societies. Thanks for watching.